The ballroom shimmered beneath a canopy of golden light, as if the chandeliers themselves had been crafted from captured stars. Every crystal strand caught the glow of candles and refracted it across the marble floor in fractured rainbows. The air was thick with scents: jasmine perfume, aged cognac, cigars rolled on distant plantations, roses flown in from across oceans. Laughter bounced between the gilded walls, laughter sharpened by arrogance and pride, laughter meant to remind the world that this room belonged only to the chosen few. Waiters glided silently through the crowd, their crisp white aprons and polished shoes the only visible markers of their presence. They carried trays that shimmered with crystal glasses, each flute filled with liquid gold, the bubbles rising like captured sparks. They moved like shadows, always present, never acknowledged. For the wealthy gathered there, the servers were furniture, background noise, pieces of machinery keeping the great feast in motion. At the center table, where the chandeliers cast their brightest glow, sat a man whose name filled newspaper headlines and dominated late-night business discussions. He was Alexander Carrington, a billionaire who wore his wealth as easily as he wore his tailored suit. His reputation for ruthlessness was matched only by his talent for expansion. Entire industries bent when he moved. His arm rested casually across the chair of the woman beside him, as though to mark territory rather than offer affection. The woman, draped in a gown of green silk that shimmered like emerald waves, leaned closer to him with a laugh too polished to be spontaneous. Her neck glittered with diamonds and sapphires, each piece carefully selected to speak of her place at his side. She laughed often, too often, a performance rehearsed in the mirror until it became second nature. Her voice rose above the music, ensuring that others nearby would notice her radiance, her confidence, her possession of everything others secretly desired. But at that very table, wealth's perfection cracked. Across from them, standing stiffly with a tray balanced carefully on trembling fingers, was a young waitress. Her black dress and white apron were clean, but worn at the edges, betraying years of service. Her eyes were ringed with shadows of exhaustion, the kind that comes not from one night of work, but from a lifetime of it. To the guests, she was invisible, a fixture that existed only to refill glasses and remove plates. But for Clara, the waitress, this moment was different. Something had caught her attention, something so sharp, so unexpected, that for a single heartbeat she forgot to breathe. Her gaze locked on the hand of the woman in green. Upon it sat a sapphire ring, its deep blue stone glowing as though it drew in all the light of the chandelier above. Clara's knees weakened. Her throat tightened until she could barely swallow. It wasn't just any ring. It was the ring. She knew it as well as she knew the lines on her own palm. The stones cut, the way its fire burned with both depth and clarity. It was unmistakable. That sapphire belonged to her mother once, years ago, before their lives unraveled. Memories surged, crashing over her like waves. Her mother sitting at the kitchen table, hands trembling as she held the ring. Her whispered sobs when she realized that even their last heirloom would have to be sold. The ring was not just jewelry. It was a story, a history, a lifeline once wrapped in love and later surrendered in despair. Her tray rattled. The flutes clinked dangerously, one nearly toppling before she steadied it with desperate fingers. Her heart pounded against her ribs, so violently she thought everyone in the ballroom must hear it. She remembered hunger gnawing her belly as a child, winters when no fire burned because rent had swallowed every coin, nights when her mother skipped meals so Clara could eat. That sapphire had been her mother's last piece of dignity, sold not for greed but for survival. And now, mockingly, shamelessly, it sat on the finger of a stranger, flaunted as decoration. The weight of injustice broke her restraint. She stepped forward, her eyes fixed unblinking on the jewel. Her voice, hoarse and trembling, slipped into the velvet air of the ballroom like a discordant note in a perfect symphony. "That ring," she whispered, though her whisper carried farther than she intended, slicing through laughter, conversation, and the clink of glass. "That ring belonged to my mother." The entire table froze. The billionaire's hand, previously relaxed, tightened on the back of his companion's chair. The charm evaporated from his expression in an instant, replaced by something far colder. His eyes narrowed. The woman in the green gown gasped audibly, her hand flying back instinctively as it burned, the sapphire flashing with emotion. She looked from Clara to Alexander, panic and confusion etched across her painted face. Around them, the ripple began. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Forks hovered in the air, forgotten. Guests leaned closer, ears straining, eyes wide with intrigue. Whispers buzzed like flies in summer heat. A servant had dared speak in the language of claim, of inheritance, of accusation. Clara trembled, realizing what she had done. She had broken the unwritten rule. The invisible were meant to stay silent. But the words could not be taken back. They hung heavy in the air, impossible to ignore. Alexander's jaw tightened. His lips parted slightly as though he might dismiss her with cruel laughter or cutting words, the way men like him often did when challenged by those beneath them. For a moment, Clara braced for it, for her dismissal, her humiliation, the punishment being bold in the wrong place. But then, something flickered across his face. Not anger, not mockery, recognition. It wasn't recognition of her. He didn't know her, but of the ring, of its history. His eyes darkened, and for a fleeting second his mask of confidence cracked. He leaned forward slightly, his lips moving, whispering words too soft for anyone else to hear. Only Clara caught them, though the entire room strained with hunger to know. And in that breath, Clara realized her outburst was not foolish after all. The truth of her claim had pierced something deep in him. From that night onward, the world she thought she knew would begin to unravel. After the gala's final toast and the swirl of silk gowns retreated into the night, Clara found herself standing at the servants' entrance, clutching her apron with trembling hands. She half expected to be dismissed on the spot, perhaps even blacklisted from ever working another banquet again. Yet, when the heavy oak doors opened, it wasn't the head waiter who stepped into the corridor. It was Alexander Carrington himself. Gone was the aura of effortless charm he carried inside the ballroom. Here, in the dim light of the corridor, his face was taut, shadows carving harsh lines along his jaw. His eyes searched hers, sharp and probing, as though every second stretched into an interrogation. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low, stripped of the polished tone he had worn in public. "Clara," she whispered, her throat dry. "And your mother's?" Her lips quivered. "Elena Hughes." The silence that followed pressed down like a physical weight. Alexander's gaze didn't waver, though something in it shifted, recognition deepening into unease. His breath caught almost imperceptibly, and his hand brushed across his mouth as if trying to conceal a crack in his composure. He asked more questions. Where they had lived, what year the ring was sold, what Clara remembered of the day. Each answer she gave seemed to harden his features, but not with anger, with guilt, with memory. Finally, he exhaled and stepped back, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I know that ring," he admitted. "I know where it came from, and I know what it cost." Clara blinked, her chest tightening. She hadn't expected acknowledgement, only denial or worse, ridicule. Over the following days, whispers circulated. Some of the gala guests dismissed her as a liar seeking attention. Others repeated the scene with relish, pointing out the way Alexander's expression had shifted when she spoke. For Clara, the gossip didn't matter. What mattered was that Alexander Carrington did not ignore her. He sought her out again, not in the marble ballroom, but in the quiet corners where no audience gathered. He asked about her childhood, about Elena, about the years that followed the sale of the ring. Clara's voice shook as she described nights without heat, meals skipped, the way her mother hid her coughing so Clara wouldn't worry. She spoke of sacrifices invisible to the world, but carved forever into her memory. Alexander listened. For the first time in his gilded life, he truly listened. He began to piece the story together, not only from Clara's words, but from his own family's history. Decades earlier, his father's company had made fortunes buying desperate assets at pennies on the dollar. To them, it had been business. To families like Clara's, it had been devastation. That sapphire had traveled from hand to hand, stripped of its story until it arrived polished in a glass case, ready to be purchased as a trophy. Alexander had given it to his companion, without ever asking what it once meant. Now, confronted by the daughter of the woman who had once wept over it. The ring no longer glittered. It weighed on him like a stone chained to his chest. Clara asked for nothing. She never begged for money, never demanded favors, never even asked for the ring back. All she wanted was acknowledgement, that her mother's suffering mattered, that the sacrifices had not been erased from history. That fragile request carried more force than any demand for riches could, and it began to change him. 1 week later, another gala was held. The same chandeliers, the same polished marble, the same glittering gowns and rehearsed laughter. But this time, as the orchestra swelled and the guests leaned in over their wine glasses, Alexander Carrington stood. He raised his hand. The room quieted. What he spoke then was not the language of profit margins or acquisitions. His voice was steady, solemn, carrying weight instead of charm. He told them about the sapphire ring, not as a jewel, but as a story. He described a mother who had given up her last heirloom to feed her child, a daughter who grew up with hunger and hardship as her daily companions. He admitted that the ring had traveled through his family's wealth, stripped of its soul, until it ended up as a careless gift. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at the floor. The laughter that had filled the hall earlier had no place here. Then Alexander reached into his pocket. He drew out the sapphire, its deep blue gleaming under the light. For the first time, it looked less like wealth and more like testimony. He turned toward Clara, who stood trembling at the side of the room, her apron still marking her as a servant among royalty. "This never belonged to me," he said, his words echoing through the hall. "It never should have." And before everyone, the same people who had watched her humiliation days earlier, he placed the ring into her hand, not as charity, not as pity, but as restoration. Clara's vision blurred with tears. She clutched the sapphire to her chest, not for vanity, but for memory, for her mother's sacrifices, for nights of hunger, for dignity lost and finally, in part, returned. The room, once filled with shallow applause, now sat in reverent silence. For the first time, wealth did not feel like triumph. It felt like shame, and, perhaps, the first stirring of redemption. From that night onward, Clara's world shifted. She did not become suddenly rich. Life did not turn into a fairy tale, but something inside her changed. She carried her mother's ring not as an ornament, but as a promise that sacrifice was not forgotten, that love outlived despair. She walked taller, her work no less heavy but her heart less burdened. And Alexander Carrington? He changed too. Quietly, steadily. He began to use his wealth differently. He invested in families on the edge of collapse rather than stripping them bare. He listened more, spoke less. For the first time, he understood that fortunes were built not only on ambition, but often on the suffering of those unseen. The sapphire ring became more than a jewel. It became a bridge, a reminder, a symbol that connected pain with hope, past with future, despair with healing. Claire and Alexander's lives remained separate in many ways, yet forever intertwined by that single night, that single truth, that single ring pointed out by trembling hands. And those chandeliers would still glitter and laughter would still echo in gilded halls. Those who had witnessed that moment carried with them a memory they could not erase. That wealth fades, but sacrifice, dignity, and love endure.